Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad you're joining us for the third session of our virtual discussion series focused on equitable implementation of healthy housing policies. My name is Shaniqua Wusu, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at ChangeLab Solutions. Before I hand it over to my colleague Liz to kick off today's discussion, I wanted to take a moment to welcome you all and briefly introduce ChangeLab. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that uses the tools of law and policy to advance health equity. We partner with communities across the nation to improve health and opportunity by changing harmful laws, policies, and systems. Our interdisciplinary team works with community organizations, governments, and local institutions to design and implement equitable and practical policy solutions to complex health challenges. At ChangeLab, we believe that laws and policies that perpetuated racism, discrimination, and segregation throughout our nation's history have had and continue to have a profound effect on health and well-being. Our work focuses on addressing what we call the fundamental drivers of health inequity, pictured here: structural discrimination and racism, income inequality, disparities in opportunity, disparities in political power, and governance that limits meaningful participation are all forces that create inequity and widen existing disparities. We outline this framework in our Blueprint for Changemakers, which is available on our website for anyone interested in diving deeper. Law and policy have played a large role in creating existing health disparities, but law and policy can also be used to address these drivers and create long-term positive change. We see equitable implementation as one way to start leveraging governance to promote health equity. Our virtual discussion series is intended to illustrate how strong housing policies paired with equitable implementation can support and promote health equity through the access of affordable, healthy, safe, and stable housing. Sessions include panel-style discussions featuring community, local, and state leaders, as well as stakeholders, who will share examples of innovative policies and implementation strategies, as well as other insights rooted in their experiences. Some of you may have joined us for our first session in this series in September, when we explored equitable implementation of housing code enforcement and specifically highlighted proactive rental inspections as one approach to improving housing conditions. Or you may have joined us for the second session in October, when we examined tenant protections and established a right to counsel, which we'll hear a bit more about today. If you were not able to join us for those sessions, we invite you to check out the recordings on our website. Today, we are here to talk about building capacity for equitable implementation of housing policies, and our panel will explore efforts to leverage federal resources to address regional concerns, state programs to improve implementation through partnerships with community agencies and CBOs, including an innovative right-to-counsel program, as well as the use of law school clinics to promote access to justice for under-resourced communities. With that, I want to thank you again for being here, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Liz Olson, to get the conversation started.
Thank you so much, Shaniqua. First, I want to just take a moment to go over some logistical notes for today. We are recording this event, and it will be posted on the ChangeLab Solutions website. You'll receive an email with a link to that recording once it's ready. If you have questions for our panelists throughout today's discussion, please submit them through the Q&A box. My ChangeLab colleagues and I will be monitoring incoming questions, and we'll have some time at the end to address them. The chat function for this webinar is also open, so we invite you to share comments or reactions along the way and engage with fellow attendees. With that, I'm going to spend a few minutes setting the context for today's discussion. So communities across the U.S. are facing profound shortages of affordable, safe, and healthy housing. These shortages reflect rising rents, stagnant wages, and low rates of housing production. They've also been exacerbated by inflation and job loss in the wake of COVID-19. Across the country, 19 million households, over 40% of renters, spend more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And approximately 6 million homes are considered substandard, presenting significant health and safety dangers to occupants. While local, state, and federal housing laws and policies provide a variety of protections intended to support healthy, stable housing by safeguarding renters against eviction or unsafe living conditions, for example, as with many other laws, there is a significant gap between the promise of the law and people's lived experiences. This gap exists in part because laws often are not implemented equitably. Today, in our third and final session of this series, we're focused on increasing government actors and community organizations' overall capacity for equitable implementation. We're asking how are regulatory agencies, state and local governments, community-based organizations, law schools, and other partners building capacity to implement innovative approaches like proactive rental inspections, tenant right to counsel, which we explored in our first two sessions, and any number of other policies that improve access to affordable, safe, and healthy housing. How can they work together to build community trust, improve access to justice, and maximize the impact of limited resources? Before we hear from our panel, I'll talk more about what we mean by equitable implementation and capacity building, provide an example, and introduce the various entities in the equitable implementation ecosystem. So throughout our nation's history, housing policies have played a central role in creating and maintaining racial inequity, and they've directly shaped the affordability crisis that we face today. Past and present laws, from segregation to exclusionary zoning, have systematically excluded Black, Indigenous, and other people of color from opportunities to build wealth and undermined housing stability. They've also had significant consequences for health. Lack of access to safe, stable, and affordable housing is associated with a range of health harms, like increased infectious and chronic disease, poor mental health, and increased mortality. Laws and policies contribute to these health disparities, but law and policy can also be used as a tool to help improve health equity. Equitable implementation is the process of ensuring that laws and policies are developed, enforced, and evaluated in ways that consider and minimize harms to systematically under-resourced and underserved communities. An equitable implementation approach considers equity through all stages of planning, development, design, and enforcement, including meaningful participation and community engagement with affected people and communities. It's also important to note that this is a continuous process, so laws and policies need to be monitored, evaluated, and amended over time to address unintended consequences and ensure they're helping to achieve greater health equity. So, since capacity building is a relatively broad term that can have a range of meanings, we'd like to offer the following definition to help ground our conversation today. In the context of equitable implementation, capacity building refers to the process of developing and strengthening the ability of government actors, community organizations, and other entities to redress harms and proactively protect rights. This can include building skills, knowledge, allocating additional resources, and developing partnerships to both bolster existing equitable implementation actions and identify and pursue new approaches. Capacity building can be focused on developing and strengthening implementation capacity within a single entity, or it may be focused on leveraging that entity's resources and expertise to build the capacity of another agency, organization, or of community members themselves. Often, capacity building efforts involve increasing partnership and coordination across levels of government, community-based organizations, and other partners to fill in gaps, increase alignment, and strengthen the implementation ecosystem overall. We're interested in diving deep on capacity building today for a few reasons. First, we know that government agencies responsible for implementing and enforcing laws often have limited capacity, which can lead to an enforcement gap or result in under-enforcement. And under-enforcement occurs when groups experiencing social and economic disadvantages also experience infrequent or inconsistent enforcement of laws that are designed to protect their well-being. For example, if there are new laws on the books that prohibit source of income discrimination in housing, but they are rarely or inconsistently enforced, such that there's no meaningful change in landlords rejecting applicants who are using housing subsidies or other types of public assistance to pay their rent, the law is under-enforced. Shifting to more equitable enforcement of these and other tenant protections likely requires agencies and jurisdictions to build capacity, to invest in new processes, infrastructure, and relationships, to remove barriers to making complaints, to expedite investigations, and to establish proactive processes like periodic testing to compare how landlords respond to applicants using housing vouchers, for example. We're also interested in exploring innovative approaches to building community capacity to promote equitable implementation. So aside from government entities, there are many community-based organizations, advocacy groups, law schools, and other academic institutions, individual community members, and others working in partnership with enforcing agencies to ensure that laws achieve their intended outcomes. Especially in the context of under-enforcement, community groups often work to fill in gaps that are left by government entities, educating community members about the law and supporting them to avail themselves of the protections it affords. Often, they're doing the important work of organizing to hold governments accountable. These partners are engaged in a wide range of capacity building activities. For example, CBOs are conducting Know Your Rights trainings to ensure renters understand the protections available to them. Law school clinics and legal aid providers are providing accessible representation or otherwise supporting community members to vindicate their rights. Tenants are organizing to influence municipal planning processes, and much, much more. As an illustration of building capacity for equitable implementation and action, consider the work of Environmental Health Watch, a nonprofit organization based in Cleveland, Ohio. Environmental Health Watch works to achieve environmental health and safety in Cleveland's homes and neighborhoods through policy, research, and a range of services like healthy housing assessments and lead-safe remediation. The organization builds community capacity through its workforce development program, which trains local community members to become lead clearance technicians and lead safe renovators. This approach capitalizes on the skills and experiences of people living in neighborhoods most burdened by lead, building a pipeline of professionals that's better equipped to understand and respond to the health and safety needs of their communities. The program's successes are at least twofold. It builds capacity to mitigate the housing and environmental hazards in the community and increases economic opportunity by creating a pathway to living wage work. So before we turn to our panel, I want to take just a moment to describe the implementation ecosystem, or the network of federal, state, and local government entities and their partners involved in implementing and enforcing housing policies. While there are other partners than those listed on the slide here, some of the major actors include elected lawmakers who draft and enact housing laws and make budgetary decisions, administrative officials who interpret, implement, and establish policy to enforce the law. These sometimes overlap with enforcing officials who ensure compliance by conducting outreach, identifying violations, or applying penalties. Academics and researchers, including legal scholars who can help analyze or evaluate the effectiveness of a particular approach, and communities, including CBOs, other groups, and individual residents. As the people most affected by housing policies, community members should play a central role in shaping and monitoring a policy's implementation so that it's responsive to their needs and vision for change. To advance equity, all of the entities pictured on this slide should work to move community from the periphery to the center of this ecosystem. Focusing in on enforcing officials for a moment, the agencies charged with ensuring compliance with the law frequently have intersecting or even overlapping authority, sometimes even when they're situated within the same level of government. For example, most laws that regulate lead, like the Residential Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act and Safe Drinking Water Act, are generally enforced at the federal level by federal agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. However, depending on the jurisdiction, enforcement of those laws or enforcement of related laws may be the responsibility of state, tribal, or territorial health departments, housing or environmental agencies, or at the local level of city or county housing authorities, health departments, and more. The overlapping nature of this ecosystem can present both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, the web of enforcing officials can be confusing, especially when officials with related authority are siloed from one another. It can be difficult for community members to navigate and get the support they need. On the other hand, when enforcing officials are working well together, they can reinforce each other's efforts and provide complementary layers of support to help keep people safe. So today's focus on building capacity intends to explore the ways in which institutions situated across this ecosystem can work together to more efficiently deploy their limited resources and maximize collective impact. All can and do have a role to play in building community trust, centering community voice, and improving access to justice. So we're now going to turn to our panel to hear about how they're building capacity for equitable implementation from their agency or organization's unique position. So with that, let me hand it over to Vince Young, an attorney at ChangeLab Solutions, who will be moderating today's discussion.
Thanks so much, Liz, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. I have the great honor of moderating today's discussion with our wonderful panelists. As Liz mentioned, I'm Vince Young, and I'm an attorney here. And our panelists today bring different perspectives to capacity building for equitable implementation of housing policies as they come from the federal and state government and also organizations serving the community. So warm welcome to our panelists. Our first panelist today is Robin Jacobs. Robin serves as an attorney advisor for the Environmental Protection Agency's Waste and Chemical Enforcement Division of the Office of Civil Enforcement. Prior to the EPA, she worked as a legal services attorney representing elderly homeowners facing the loss of their home, as an assistant attorney general for the Maryland Department of the Environment, representing the agency in lead paint enforcement cases, and as the director of strategic legal services projects at the Community Law Center. Our second panelist is Philippe Nab. Philippe is the Reentry and Eviction Defense Program Manager with the Washington State Office of Civil Legal Aid. Philippe supports implementation of the nation's first statewide appointed counsel model for the right to counsel in eviction defense proceedings. He brings a varied background in direct services and program development, including 15 years as a public defender and civil legal aid attorney at the Bronx Defenders and Legal Aid Society, respectively, and as the former managing attorney for the Northwest Justice Project. And our third panelist today is Deja Chambers. Deja is a second-year law student at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and she is the co-leader of the student-led pro bono project, Free the Land, which focuses on the intersections of land use, environmental justice, and community organizing. So welcome to our panelists, and thank you so much for being here. And I want to kick off today's discussion by introducing some of the work that your agencies and organizations do and explore how that work leads to more equitable implementation of laws and policies. So Robin, if we could start with you, can you share a little bit more about some of the work that the EPA does to promote safe, affordable, and stable housing?
Sure, thanks, Vince. So one of the things the EPA does is provide resources. I'll probably focus my remarks today on the work that I do around lead paint enforcement. So one tool that we just came out with is a toolkit for environmental justice toolkit for lead paint enforcement, which I'm hoping people in the audience will take a look at after this conversation. And that's intended to assist other co-regulators and community members in navigating our lead paint laws and lead paint enforcement and us implementing those in an equitable way. There's also a local lead action plan guide that's a framework specifically for local governments interested in addressing lead hazards in their community in a more comprehensive way and figuring out where there's opportunities to further lead hazard reduction. EPA also supports the pediatric environmental health specialty units, which exist across the country and provide medical expertise on various environmental hazards, including lead paint, among others. So we also work, as Liz kind of laid out pretty nicely, in terms of being a co-regulator. So there's a few different federal lead paint related laws. One is the renovation, repair, and painting rule. And that's something that some states actually implement, as Liz also alluded to. And that regulates people who are disturbing lead paint, making sure those folks are trained and people are safe when that work is done. There's also a lead activities rule that regulates inspection, abatement, and those sorts of professions, similarly making sure that that work is done safely and properly. And finally, the lead disclosure rule, which is only implemented by the federal level, and that requires a certain disclosure at every lease or sale of pre-1978 housing to ensure people know about any known hazards in those homes. So we have those laws to enforce in partnership with states as well, where they're authorized. And we have certain priority areas that we set out each year. And our current focuses are sort of geographic initiatives where we know there's a lot of issues around lead hazards, and entities with far-reaching influence. So that's like a big box store, a Home Depot, or a large property management company where they have a big footprint. But that's kind of the lay of what we're doing currently around lead safety and enforcement specifically. Thanks.
Wonderful. A lot of great work happening at the EPA and great work happening in Washington State. So Philippe, the Washington Office of Civil Legal Aid helps to provide legal services to indigent people, including a right-to-counsel program for tenants facing eviction. Can you tell us a little bit more about this program and how it works?
Absolutely. It's something we're really excited about. It passed in 2001, and it passed at the same time as two other states passed statewide right to counsels for indigent tenants. But one thing that makes Washington State's program a little bit different than all the other programs, and let me just take a quick step back and saying what that means for folks is that every low-income individual should be entitled to an attorney in an eviction proceeding. So if someone is going to be displaced lawfully, then they should be entitled to the due process at bare minimum of having an attorney represent them in that proceeding. The reason that is important and the reason that that's meaningful is that, as I'm sure many people don't, but some might not know, the range between or the kind of the delta between landlords represented by attorneys and tenants represented by attorneys was incredibly large. So we don't have specific statistics in Washington State, but nationally and from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, landlords are represented almost at 100%, 90% above, and tenants universally were represented at a much lower rate. And there's some variation, but the imbalance in that is incredibly stark. And so this law really kind of fundamentally changes that imbalance, provides representation for every low-income individual who is facing the lawful displacement. So that passed in 2001. It was operational as of January 2022, and since that time, every low-income tenant who's eligible, and it's a pretty broad eligibility standard. It's 200% federal poverty level, has received a attorney funded by Washington State, which is thanks for putting that in the chat, Maya. And that what makes this program different than the other kind of jurisdictions that have tried this right to counsel is that it's actually the court's obligation to appoint attorneys for low-income individuals in the statute. So something like I think the analogy that most people think of is criminal proceedings, where everyone understands that a pro se litigant can't go through a criminal proceeding without a lawyer. They're entitled to that under the Constitution. Under statute, the court has an obligation to appoint a lawyer for an indigent tenant in Washington State. And that's really kind of let us be able to work with the courts and different interest holders that may have had less interest in being cooperative than we would have otherwise. In the short time, and Maya already put it in the chat, and you'll hear me talk about this repeatedly. We put all of the data we get from our providers on our website as we get it. And, the program's represented over 12,000 low-income individuals in eviction proceedings in Washington state, which is, a huge number of folks who are going through these proceedings. And so what we do is we fund and oversee legal services providers in all 37 judicial districts. Washington state has 39 counties and 37 judicial districts. And we had to work with the courts in each one of those judicial districts to set up appointment protocols and processes to ensure that that individuals facing eviction in those jurisdictions were able to get attorneys appointed for them. In addition to that, one of our primary mandates is to make sure that there is equitable access across jurisdictions. So if you get an attorney in King County, which is our largest county, home of Seattle, or if you get an attorney in some of our counties that are incredibly small with 3,000 residents and 7-hour drive from Seattle, that you're going to get the same level of representation regardless of geographic location and regardless of the other factors that may influence that. And certainly there is a significant, and we're in a great place to be able to see it, but there's a significant difference in how these cases are approached in different jurisdictions and locations. And so one of our main mandates is to make sure that there is both training, supervision, and resources available for equitable representation, equitable outcomes, regardless of jurisdiction. And we do that through oversight, monitoring, providing trainings, and continual assessment of program resources and needs.
Thank you so much for sharing insight into this very important program that you have in Washington state. And finally, Deja, you co-lead the Free the Land project. Can you tell us a little bit about what the project is and some of the goals of the project?
So Free the Land project is one of many student-initiated pro bono projects at Berkeley Law. And our project is focused on equitable, environmental justice, land use, community organizing. And so we've partnered with a lot of organizations, really focused on either informing community members about how to be involved in local processes. For example, we partnered with an organization in West Oakland where we were informing residents about how they could bring concerns forward about zoning violations and illegal trucking, and how they could escalate those concerns if the city was not responding to them in a timely manner. We've done projects where we're helping organizations with legal research questions surrounding housing and other environmental justice concerns. And this semester, we have a project that's focused on housing policies as the cities in California are developing their housing element plans, which is a plan where the cities are developing a policy that would help identify how the city is going to meet existing and projected housing needs. As cities are going through this process, we're helping residents comment on the process and basically provide their input so that cities are providing plans that really will address projected housing needs. So that's a little bit about some of the projects we've done and the things we're doing this semester.
All right. Thank you, Deja. And thank you, everyone, for giving us a little insight into what your orgs and agencies do. So as mentioned in the presentation earlier, governments can partner with a range of stakeholders to advance health equity in housing. So I'd like to start this discussion about partnerships between government entities specifically, for example, across different levels of government or across agencies and how they might work together. So, Robin, as you had mentioned in the recently published Environmental Justice Toolkit for Lead Paint Enforcement, there's a little section about co-regulation. And I'd like to ask what co-regulation means to you in your work and what type of agencies can co-regulate in the healthy housing space, and also what these agencies can do better to collaborate and improve the effectiveness of their policies.
Yeah, I thought this was laid out really nicely earlier on. We can be siloed on the one hand, which makes it really difficult for communities to navigate the various agencies that regulate in this space. And as someone who used to work representing community groups, I know how difficult that can be. And then we have, reinforcing policies. And that's, I think, when we are working well together. So I knew it was really important in putting together a toolkit around environmental justice that partnership had to really be at the center of this work, because there is an array of agencies that are addressing various points. So I kind of went over the various federal authorities that we can enforce, but some of those, like we said, are actually enforced at the state and local level. I imagine some of the people who are here today actually do the work of EPA on the state level. So some states actually are authorized to run those programs around lead activities or the renovation, repair, and painting rule. There's also a lot of states, tribes, and local departments of health may have authority to issue abatement orders when it comes to lead. That's often in response to a notification of a child having an elevated blood level. And so then when that abatement order might be issued on the local level, the person that's contracted to do that abatement would need to follow that EPA rule around, making sure that abatement is done safely, the EPA rule or the equivalent state rule. And then if that's not done, if there's some assessment done at that local level in response to the elevated blood level, well, that's then a known hazard that, before the property is transferred or leased again, that next person would need to, would in order to follow that lead disclosure rule at the federal level, that information about the lead hazards would need to be disclosed to that buyer or tenant. There's also local housing departments who play a big role in this space, including building code officials and permitting offices. So one way we've seen this work really nicely is if there's some cross training. So some code enforcement officers get trained in renovation, repair, and painting rule issues so that there can be some cross, contamination, or I guess there's probably a more positive word than that. But there can be, referrals made between agencies where they notice issues. Or, the permitting office can require, before someone gets a building construction permit, they would have to show that they're certified to do renovations on pre-78 properties if that's what they're planning to do. There's also HUD, which I mentioned before is another federal agency that co-regulates with EPA in terms of the lead disclosure rule. Both HUD and EPA have enforcement authority for the lead disclosure rule, and then HUD funds public housing authorities, and HUD actually has a lead safe housing rule, which requires federally assisted housing to meet a higher standard of safety when it comes to lead. State and tribal environmental agencies I already kind of mentioned, and then construction licensing and consumer protection agencies often regulate contractors. So there's quite a few agencies in this landscape, and I think relationship building and kind of connecting those dots for people is really important in our work.
Appreciate you sharing some insight into the complex and interconnected web and mosaic of enforcement agencies at all levels. So, Philippe, I'd like to get kind of the state agency's perspective on what co-regulation might mean. So, as an agency that helps provide representation for low-income tenants facing eviction, can you talk about the role that co-regulating partners such as other state agencies or local governments can play in ensuring that low-income tenants can vindicate their rights through the legal system?
Absolutely. And I guess, before I get into specifics, and I think we have some great resources on the website that Maya had put in the chat before. We actually have all of our memos to the courts that really give a great example of the issues that come up in this. But I think one of the things that one of the ways I kind of frame the program that we fund and oversee is that the attorneys who are representing low-income tenants are really the individuals of last resort and the intervention of last resort for low-income folks facing eviction through our legal system. And so part of their job really is to not only make sure that the legal process is providing all of the due process that is entitled to them, but that all of the other interventions that Washington State has funded or is otherwise federally available, that those have also been exhausted. Basically, that all the resources available to that individual have been exhausted before they get legally displaced. And so that requires a pretty significant amount of coordination and interaction with rent subsidy providers, public housing authorities who are, rent subsidy typically is administered locally at the state level, but comes from in a lot of cases was federally provided during the pandemic, and then public housing providers, which are obviously federal entities. And so the folks that we fund and we oversee and their mandate, really has this necessity to work with other system partners to make sure that all of the resources that are available to prevent displacement are being utilized and have been brought to bear at that individual's case. Probably from our perspective, the folks we work with the most and the entities that we work with the most, and sometimes a very cooperative, easy relationship, and sometimes not quite so cooperative and easy, is the courts. Because we don't have direct authority over the courts, but we have a mandate in the statute that to implement this program. And at least in our interpretation, we can mandate that eviction proceedings not be heard if in a given jurisdiction if there is not counsel available. So there's all kinds of issues that have come up. There is a list of memos that we've sent to the court on specific issues. And just some examples is, and this I think is a good example of it. There were some jurisdictions when this law was passed where providers were seeing cases that weren't being offered attorneys, and we made it very clear our expectation is that an eviction defense attorney should interject at that point and remind the court of their obligation to provide an attorney to each and every lawyer or each and every tenant. So our providers were worried that they would get in trouble from the court by interjecting in a case that they're not of record on. So we sent a letter to the court indicating that we had instructed our funded attorneys to interject in any case that there is not an attorney. And so those are that's just one example of kind of how we dealt with various issues that came up. A lot of times our interests are aligned and a lot of times they weren't aligned. And I think that there is a pretty complicated push and pull that we've been dealing with in partners that have competing authority and jurisdiction.
Thank you. I really appreciate that insight, and just really highlights the importance of leveraging the government's regulatory enforcement powers to promote and to effectuate greater equity in all these processes, including eviction, including tenant defense, and also in healthy housing. So next, I'd like to talk about where the community fits in. But before we can get to robust partnerships where governments and communities engage to build each other's capacities, we need to set the foundation that underlies this relationship. So communities need to first be able to engage with the government and second, feel comfortable in doing so. So Deja, I'd like to turn to you and ask about one of your housing element projects. So this project assists local community-based organizations with advocating for their interests before municipal governments, specifically ensuring that community voices are heard by local decision makers when they design the municipality's housing elements. So why is it important to empower the community to come and advocate when these housing elements are being prepared?
Just stepping back for a moment, we're partnered with East Bay for Everyone and Inclusive Lafayette, and these are two organizations that are focused on the East Bay and their housing element plans. And so these are organizations that are started by the community members. They're recruiting community members and encouraging them to really engage in the process through either public comment at city council meetings or submitting written comment letters. And so what we're seeing is there are some competing interests between the cities who are developing these housing element plans and the California Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, which is overseeing and approving the city's plans. And so typically a city is trying to put forth a plan that shows that there is a space where they could potentially build affordable housing. And then they are tasked with specifically identifying land that could happen, and then HCD will approve it. And what we're seeing is that HCD, there's a provision that allows HCD to take over if cities aren't actually implementing feasible projects or specific projects where affordable housing can take place. And so what we're really helping residents do is going in first at the city council level and submitting comments challenging the specific land that the city is identifying as places where affordable housing can be built. An issue we're seeing across cities is that they're identifying areas of land where on paper development might be feasible, but that a developer would never actually go in and build a project like that there. So we're helping members of these groups submit comment letters, and we're submitting our own comment letters to help amplify their concerns and help sort of build awareness and hopefully build momentum around what these concerns are. And then we're also, another part of that is once it's left the city council level and once sent to HCD for approval, we're also submitting comments to HCD because the city is not necessarily communicating some of the, challenges with actually implementing those projects. And so then we need to bring it to HCD's attention so that hopefully HCD would not approve these elements. And the reason why this is important is just because these residents are integrated in these communities. They know about the specific areas of land that the city council is identifying, whereas HCD might not. And residents really are able to, one, identify issues that they've seen historically about why, historically there hasn't been affordable housing built on certain plots of land. They're able to sometimes in these city council meetings, they're suggesting alternatives and they're suggesting ways for the city to actually implement this law in a way that is that will truly meet their needs and actually fulfill the goals of the housing element, which is to build affordable housing, to build inclusive housing. A big thing that HCD has said that they want to focus on this year in the housing element plans is addressing the patterns of segregation and historical barriers that have limited access and why the East Bay has historically been a place where there has not been a lot of affordable housing. And so we're trying to amplify resident voices because they are best able to identify what has historically been happening, what are ways that we can address this issue, what are specific areas, specific areas of land where these things are unfeasible, what are alternatives. The residents are really able to articulate that. And so we're trying to get this city council to listen to the residents' concerns and listen to the alternatives that the residents are proposing.
Definitely. This really underlies how important it is for community members to be able to access the government and to be able to engage with them and to advocate for their own interests. I think the second part of this is community trust, and a collaborative partnership between the community and the government depends on this trust. And so I like to pose the next question to either Philippe or Robin and ask what considerations or actions are your agencies making or undertaking to build that community trust?
I think Deja put this really well. It's, the community knows their neighborhoods the best. And so we really have to listen to them and place them at the center of this work. We're still very complaint driven in the enforcement that we do. And so especially when it comes to housing, there's a lot of fear of retaliation. So one thing I forgot to mention earlier that I wanted to make sure to talk about is, some places have enacted proactive rental inspections, some specifically to lead. And that's another example of kind of co-regulation where these regulations are really reinforcing each other at each level. And that can kind of help in terms of that fear of retaliation if you have these like proactive rules. And I think building trust is just a key part of ensuring that people feel like they can call us with complaints, and we'll take action. So that's something I think we're trying to be cognizant of, and really making sure communities, know that we're here and that we're responsive to them.
Yeah, I certainly would like to interject on that too, just because I think that I think we're all aware, at least within our agency, that the eviction system is not something that the community trusts, and very appropriately so. It's historically racist and harms poor people, and it has harmed poor people for a long, long time. So we understand the distrust, whether there's a lawyer there or not a lawyer there. And one of the repercussions of that is that folks are giving up their rental properties without going to court because they appropriately feel like there's no hope in this system. So when this program started, we funded a targeted outreach campaign focusing primarily on non-English speakers and low-income communities of colors to work through trusted messengers to talk about this program, specifically the right-to-counsel program. And then we also sought additional funding to provide free right-to-counsel legal services to help inform communities that would otherwise have maybe not gone to court of these additional rights. So, there is not a way to make up for what the kind of harm that these systems have done over many, many generations, but being aware of it and trying to address it appropriately the best we can within our resources is an important part of building that trust, and then showing up and showing communities that there are possibilities other than displacement.
Thank you. I want to push on this conversation about roles and the role the governments have in undoing previous injustices and inequities that have happened historically in this country. So as you discussed, entities at all levels, including governments and communities, all have a role to play, including in relationship with each other. And then by working together, they can create a force multiplier that maximally promotes equitable outcomes. I think first, Robin, I'd like to turn to you and ask just about the role of EPA, what role the EPA can take. I know earlier you spoke about some of the specific work the EPA does, but what role can the EPA play in partnering with state, local, tribal entities to build community capacity?
Well, there's a few different ways we can do that. Like I said, there's ways we can partner on training and outreach. One example that we have in the toolkit is we offer free RRP, renovation, repair, and painting training in English and Spanish in communities where we knew there were a lot of lead hazards. So that's something we've done before, where we do some sort of outreach work, really localized. Then I think Maya put in the chat, of course, the targeting is a big part of our enforcement work. So, of the authorities we have, the lead disclosure rule is going to be more applicable in communities with environmental justice concerns where there's a higher proportion of rentals, in part because the renovation, repair, and painting rule, we don't have a legal hook if, people are doing their own renovations, which is often the case in those communities. And we've actually, the counterpart to my office does a lot of outreach around, how to renovate safely if you're doing it yourself. So we try to be really cognizant about targeting those properties that are like repeat offenders where they're causing a problem over time. And then doing more expansive investigations where there's a really egregious violator. So we have limited capacity and resources at the government levels as well. And so where can we kind of have the biggest bang for our buck and kind of go after those larger actors and get all of the sub actors in compliance? There's a number of challenges in enforcement work in communities with environmental justice concern. Ownership can be really complicated. A lot of companies create multiple LLCs. There's a lot of short-term or oral leases. There's heirs property where people maybe haven't left a will. So ownership can be really complicated to figure out in these communities, and that can be a challenge for enforcement. So I'm not sure I'm addressing exactly your question, but I think we can. Another resource I wanted to mention too is that, HUD provides quite a bit of funding around healthy housing. So as opposed to the enforcement where, sometimes the enforcement approach makes sense, sometimes people just need resources to fix their house. And so those programs are like a really good example of a way the federal government provides a partnership with state and local entities, for those people who just need the extra funding to fix their property. An enforcement response is not necessarily appropriate for them because it's not going to have any impact because they can't pay the penalty. So the appropriate government federal response to that is resources so that they can just fix the problem.
Thank you. I wanted to open up to Philippe or Deja if there any additional follow-up or discussion about roles that could aspirationally be played by the government that may not be happening now, but you think could be useful in order to promote equity in a housing setting.
Yeah, one thing that came to mind as Robin was talking about communicating and education, one thing that we've noticed in housing elements is that, for example, we attended a city council meeting in Pleasant Hill, and there was a presentation given about where the city was in its housing element, what the plans were. And there was just a lot of technical language that was used. And so to that point about communicating with residents, obviously in languages that they're speaking is very important, but also in terms of breaking down the terms that are being used so residents can really understand what's going on. And also that helps them it builds confidence that they can engage in this process if they can understand what's happening, what are the city's goals, what are the requirements that the cities are having to meet by law, and where are the areas where there are challenges in meeting what the housing element is legally required to do with what are the practical implementation issues. And so if residents are better able to have transparency with the city, I think that they would engage more, one, but that there would also just be more trust built as far as whether the city was really trying to include them as a part of this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think building on what both Robin and Deja has said, I think that a lot of what's going to happen pursuant to the addition of this program is really, there's going to be a creation of a tenant interest group or a tenant stakeholder group in government that wouldn't have existed otherwise, because they're going to get the language and the information that's necessary to create that. I mean, I don't know that we have anything to show that yet, but I certainly know that the culture of engagement within the court on these issues has changed. And I imagine that having this many tenants coming into contact with attorneys who are telling them about their rights and their roles and helping to empower them is going to create kind of the additional impetus to have more of a voice in issues that affect low-income renters.
Yeah, I think that's a role that may not be immediately obvious or intuitive that the government can definitely play in facilitating these essentially coalitions of tenants who are far stronger together than they would, standing alone in front of eviction proceedings. So that's a very important role that you highlighted, Philippe. So I'd like to close today's discussion with, a little bit about the role of law school clinics and of student-led organizations, as well as both a valuable capacity building partner and also as a training ground for the next generation of public interest and government attorneys. So Deja, given your time and experience with Free the Land, what aspect of your project's work do you think would be most valuable to you as a future lawyer, and how has your experience shaped your thoughts about career goals and potential paths?
Yeah, this has definitely opened my eyes to the ways that laws, even when they are, they specifically have equitable goals in them. Some of these housing element has, language that focuses on equity and affordable housing, but the ways that implementation can affect meeting those goals in a way that's truly effective for residents. And so just seeing that process has definitely been very valuable as far as my law school experience, but also just understanding the way that lawyers can play a part in that sort of advocacy or coalition building along with residents, along with community organizations, in ways that the law can be just one tool to help bring these goals to reality. And so I think understanding that, seeing that play out has been very valuable. And I think going forward in my law school career, I will definitely look for ways to, again, always make sure that there's, especially when we're talking about things that really directly affect community members, which pretty much all law does, but things like housing, there needs to be some sort of coalition building with community organizations and with residents. And I really understand that, and will continue to seek out, that sort of strategy.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see what your future career brings for you, Deja, and I hope you find space where, your future work is as inspiring as informative as your work with the Free Land Project. So I'd like to open this question up to Philippe and Robin to talk about ways you think that law school clinics and, orgs affiliated with the law school can help advance the work of your agencies.
Yeah, I mean, we always have law clerks, so please feel free to apply to the EPA. And we are in a historic hiring phase, so I encourage folks to consider joining the agency. There's a lot of really exciting work going on.
This is actually a great question for me to also answer Brooke's question in the chat about caseloads, because as some of you may know, in public defense also, there is a huge lack of available counsel for indigent folks. It's hard work and not the most well-paying, and so it's been hard to staff folks. And so part of this and part of what we did was we developed something called the Housing Justice Collaborative with Seattle University School of Law, which is one of Washington State's 3 law schools. And what it does is, OCLA, the Office of Legal Aid, provided funding for public interest legal fellowships for the summer, and Seattle University created a fairly robust practicum in housing law and tenant defense. And so what we're doing is trying to create a pipeline of tenant defense lawyers. I mean, this is relatively new work, especially in the scale that it's been done, and showing a generation of new lawyers that this type of work is justice work, and that this is this is like public defense. If they want to work in justice work, eviction defense is a good option. And then giving them the skills so that they'll be ready to do the work when they get out of school. And so it's been a really positive and successful collaboration, and our intent to make sure that we're dealing with the staffing issues that are coming up. And then just 2 other things to finish answering the question that was in the chat on how we deal with the staffing. We recently, the law was amended to mandate remote appearances. And so we're able to cover appearances from anywhere in the state where necessary. We still prefer in-person counsel. And then on top of that, we issue a caseload guideline. So a maximum that a eviction defense attorney can, maximum number of cases that eviction defense attorney can handle in Washington. So, we certainly have went to law schools to try to create a pipeline of lawyers to do this work. And it's been a big part of what we do, knowing that staffing is a consistent and persistent issue for us.
Thank you for sharing that, Philippe. And I just wanted to invite the audience, if you have any questions for any of our panelists about either programs they run or about their roles in capacity building, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll get to them. But we have one more question here for Robin. Can you discuss the EPA's role in lead abatement in commercial properties?
Yeah. So most of our laws are really focused on residential properties. That's usually where, you're most at risk. Children are most at risk, who are the most vulnerable. So, but it does point to something else I wanted to say earlier, which is that there's a part of the toolkit that I wanted to draw people's attention to, which really focuses on the remedies from our enforcement cases. And we can't always get this, but we do have several examples of cases where we've actually gotten abatements ordered or gotten them through supplemental environmental projects, which is when a defendant basically chooses to take on a project, to address some of the underlying cause of the violation. So those are really the best case scenario outcome of our enforcement cases, because I see it as it remedies the problem going forward. But another way we can do that, there's actually imminent and substantial endangerment authority under several environmental statutes, including the one that governs waste, which is known as the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, or RCRA. And that's only been used a handful of times, but it's something the agency is looking at. So when something qualifies as an imminent and substantial endangerment, so an example of this may be like kicking up a lot of lead dust in something involving a commercial building, that authority could trigger an enforcement action. And unlike our other authorities, it actually can require abatement ordered. But like I said, it's only been done a handful of times. There's not a lot of experience doing it. The other thing I'll mention, and this is just a really creative approach that I think the agency has taken in Clean Air Act cases, which you wouldn't think would be related to housing at all, but in Clean Air Act cases, there's particular pollutants like sulfur dioxide and ozone emissions that actually exacerbate the deterioration of lead paint. Those cases involve refineries, and the penalties tend to be incredibly large. And so we've actually had a few cases involving those sort of violators where those violators have paid for lead abatement in that community. So there's ways to think about these things a little more creatively. I know lawyers don't always have a reputation for that, but I think we do our best work when we are creative.
Thank you so much, Robin. I'm scanning for questions. Let's see.
So I see one in the chat about whether clinical students would be able to meaningfully reduce the backlog of eviction defense lawyers. And I do think that that would not be able to meaningfully reduce the actual case handling capacity. And I think that another thing that is important and something we try to stress in talking about this program is really we want to have the eviction defense program be an entitlement, right? The government should pay for this, and it shouldn't be that you are relegated to substandard or less than a lawyer because there is a deficiency. It should be something that the government is funding in a way that each person is entitled to a lawyer. So, we really try to stay away from mixing volunteer lawyers, clinical lawyers. I mean, obviously they can do great work and should supplement insofar as they're building capacity in the future. But we really do want to be clear that this is a entitlement, same way that you would be entitled to a lawyer if you had a criminal case, and filling in gaps with either pro bono or other options really isn't. I don't think does a great job of getting us where we want to go eventually, which is that everyone is entitled to this level of due process.
Definitely. Thank you for your answer, Philippe. I think as a final closing question, I'd like to ask the panelists for any final thoughts you might have on how people should identify capacity building needs and to begin capacity building to achieve equitable implementation.
I guess I'll start it. And, I think that one thing I haven't mentioned so far that I did want to mention is our program. We keep all of our data on our website, and part of that is demographic data. And for example, in Washington State, the state identifies as 76% white. In our program, only 52% of tenants represented are white. And it's, I think, 7 times the amount of African-American tenants are benefiting from our program, and 6 times the amount of Native American tenants are benefiting from our program. So the program is benefiting the populations we want to benefit with this program. And I think part of that is that we're looking in the right places, right? These are systems, and for folks who haven't read the book Evicted, I highly recommend it. But these are systems that are disproportionately harming communities and low-income communities, primarily low-income communities of color. And so I think that, looking at the systems that are doing that type of harm is going to get you to places where both you're interfacing with communities in a way that is positive for both the community and for the government, and is making change. So I don't know that there's a great coalition building story behind it, but you have to look in the right places and look to the right indicators to see where that is where those types of interventions are going to be successful in generating change in community.
I'd just add, I think it's really incumbent, especially on folks in government, to kind of get outside the comfort zone. And so that requires, being okay with some discomfort and being okay with, I think I personally have just benefited a lot in having started a career in community lawyering and seeing things from the community perspective, working at the state that had a very strong lead law that actually the penalties funded the enforcement work, and being able to do that work, to working in a legal aid office. And I think, if you open yourself up to those other experiences, I think you're more likely to bring those voices with you into the policy rooms where they need to be heard. I hope there's a day in the future where it's just they're directly heard from Deja's clients, and they're in the room when those decisions are made. And I think that's what we're really working towards. So, and the pay is actually good in the government. So consider that for students considering where to go next.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And unfortunately, we are at time, but I wish I had more with you, but I'm very grateful for the conversation we were able to have today. And I want to thank you, Philippe, Robin, Deja, for participating on our panel, and the audience for tuning in. So with that, I'll hand it over to Liz to close us out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vince. And a huge thank you again to Philippe, Robin, and Deja. It was so wonderful to hear more about your work and all of the kind of innovative ways that you all are working to build community power, strengthen partnerships across government. So thank you so much for sharing your insights and your time with us today. If you want to learn more about equitable implementation, please take a look at the resources available on our website, many of which we've pictured up on this slide here. We have a guide to equitable enforcement, a comprehensive guide to proactive rental inspection programs, which Robin mentioned earlier, and other housing and good governance resources, in addition to the recordings of the first two sessions of this series. Stay tuned for a forthcoming publication on right-to-counsel as well. Before we close, please note again that we'll be posting a link to this recording along with a summary of the conversation and any key resources that our panelists mentioned on our website at ChangeLab Solutions. And please also stay in touch and feel free to reach out to our extremely knowledgeable panelists. Our contact information is listed up on this slide in case you'd like to follow up. So thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to everyone in the audience for attending. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.